Recording now. Thank you, kids.
I didn't say that.
Okay, so we finished off. We're still talking about our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Looking at some of our rights and our freedoms. Why is this not working? It is working. Well, now it is. Okay. So you just finished your project on Friday. Hopefully, some of you probably played games. Guilty. Okay. Some of you probably, hit it out of the park. Some of you maybe not so much. That's okay. That's life. Okay. One of the things that needs to be taught with teaching people about their rights, their freedoms, is also that there's responsibilities. So we've already discussed in the classroom, what are your responsibilities as a student? To smile politely when asked a question, fair enough. What are your responsibilities as a student? You have a right to education, but what's your responsibility? Anyone, just say something. Well, what's your responsibility? What do you have to do on your end? What does it mean to have a responsibility? Actually, that's a better question. So let's say you're, how many of you play, a couple of you guys play hockey, right? We all understand hockey? Okay, if you are a forward, what is your responsibility? What do you do? You attempt to score. What else do you do? Do you stand in the net like this? Glove up? Oh, you're forward. You're in a certain place on the ice. Okay. So if you're a student, what's your responsibility? A bunch of you have part of it you're holding in your hand. To bring a pencil, writing utensil, right? To have your, what's in front of you? Notes. To bring your brain with you when you come to school. Okay, don't leave that at home. That would be irresponsible. Okay. Now, your rights and freedoms in the Charter, so if you have the right to vote, is it your responsibility to educate yourself on who you're voting for? Or should you just close your eyes, throw something at a dartboard, print out the political party leader's face, put it on a wall and just throw like that? Should we do that?
Maybe fun.
Might be fun, but is that responsible?
No.
Not really, right? So you have the right to drive a vehicle after you pass your driver's exam, but you have a responsibility to follow the rules, right? So you don't harm yourself or someone else. Okay. Now, even though we don't necessarily teach you thoroughly about what laws there are and what not to break, it is your responsibility to be educated. So if you're driving a vehicle, it's your responsibility to know what the rules are, right? You can't claim ignorance. You never get to go. Hello. She is here. Yes. Okay. Awesome. Sounds good. Bye. Thank you for your patience. So, as mentioned in the previous chapters, if you commit a crime and you stand in front of a judge and say, Your Honor, hand to my heart, I didn't know that was illegal. I didn't know that I wasn't allowed to go 200 kilometers an hour in a school zone. Nobody told me. It's still your fault. It's your responsibility. If you're operating a vehicle, it's your responsibility to know the rules. Your Honor, I didn't know that there were security cameras. I didn't know that I couldn't just eat these donuts laid out. You ever been to a Safeway? You've seen the pastries? They just lay them out there. Can I just take one? Come on, there's no barcode on a donut. Can I take it? What about the candy bar? It's just sitting there. No one's watching it. It's your responsibility to know what the rules are. If you break the rules and you get caught, that's a key point here, if you get caught, because not everyone does, then maybe you get excluded from doing certain things, like voting, like leaving the country, like moving around freely. If you do really bad things, maybe they'll put you on a list and make that list public so people know, hey, this dangerous person is living in this neighborhood.
America's most wanted.
Maybe. So we are going to transition now and look at various moments in history when people's rights were taken away from them for a variety of reasons. So obviously, many of you probably have learned about the history of Indigenous people in Canada. There is a chapter later on. From when European explorers showed up, many Indigenous people have had a very difficult time with these relationships. But quite frankly, anytime historically two groups met, there was always a bit of conflict. I don't know if you know about the Mongols. You know about the Mongolians? No? No one? Really? Are you serious? Jack, you know. Okay. And the Mongolians, they would just go around, they'd conquer people. They're like on horseback, bow and arrow. You've seen Game of Thrones, the Dothraki are kind of based off the Mongolians. And they would just run into an area, take over the place, kill everyone. It's very, very common. It's unfortunate, but it was common. Anyways, once the Canadian government was formed in 1867, about 10, 11 years later, the Canadian government passes the Indian Act where they really regulate what Indigenous people can and cannot do, who is and isn't Indigenous. So they're basically saying that we have the right to take away your freedoms, and we're going to govern over you, we're going to be responsible for you, and that means that we get to decide what you can and can't do. So there's a little blurb there. Section 12 of the Indian Act apparently states a person means an individual other than an Indian, other than an Indigenous person. So they didn't view them as humans potentially through the law. Like, how would you feel if there was a law that put into place anyone from Leduc is not a person and has no rights? The Indigenous Act then goes on to limit and restrict the expression of Indigenous ways of life, whether that's ceremonies, whether that's hunting and fishing, feeding themselves, moving around. The Indian Act also limited who could move freely from reserve to reserve, what would happen if you got married, how you gain or lose Indigenous Indian status. Also the 2 points, or this first point here, if they wanted to wear some of their more traditional clothing, hold a ceremony, they needed to request permission from the government to do so. Now, obviously, in modern day life, you still need to request, permission from the government to do a lot of things. So we discussed in one of the other lectures, let's say you buy a house and you want to demolish the main floor and put like a little bouncy castle in the basement. So you have a 2-story bouncy castle in a house. Do you think you can just do that?
Probably not.
Probably not. You would need to get, to an extent, you would need to get a permit to make that major adjustment to the house. Do you think you can just demolish your house and build something new without telling anyone?
Yes.
No, you need to get a permit. You need to get people, safety inspectors and whatnot. So there are a lot of restrictions on what people can and can't do right now as well. But did any of you have to ask the government permission to put up a Christmas tree? Assuming you put one up, I don't do that. Anyone? How many of you put up a Christmas tree? Couple of you, right? How many of you had a Christmas dinner? Right, maybe a handful of you. These are things that we don't have to ask the government to do. These are your cultural celebrations, your traditional celebrations. Additionally, the history of women in Canada. I actually did some research on this a while back. When Canada was part of the British Empire and the British Empire banned slavery, all black people living in the British Empire became citizens and were given the right to vote. So I have read in some places that black women could vote much sooner than this, but that might vary. I would have to go back in and do that research again. Anyways, until 1918, women in general were barred meaning they were prevented from voting and participating in government. Now, one thing that's important to understand is that in 1918, it wasn't all women across the board that got the right to vote. Certain women of certain ethnicities and skin colors, whatever, gained the right to vote later on. They didn't all get it uniquely at the same time, or uniformly at the same time. And I don't know all the details of that off the top of my head. Okay. That attempt to gain the right to vote is called women's suffrage. I'm going to move on. So internment in Canadian history is quite interesting. Not a lot of people know this. Do we understand what the word internment means? Have we heard this before? Okay. Have you heard of the phrase in an internment camp? No? Okay. So internment or internment camps, if I can remember off the top of my head accurately, is essentially the government might decide that there's a particular group of people that could be seen as a threat. Maybe we're at war. They set up an internment camp to then move those people in there to keep an eye on them, to prevent them from harming the country, citizens. And my friend was learning about this, and he shared with me that to an extent it was also set up to keep them safe. So particularly the Japanese. We'll discuss that in the next one. But during World War I, people from Eastern Europe were the enemy. You'll learn more about World War I next year in grade 11. And so Canadian citizens, many of whom might have been born in Canada but were born Ukrainian or German, were put into internment camps to be watched, to have an eye kept on them, because they were considered enemies of Canada because we were at war with them, or the British Empire was at war with them. Right, and so they didn't just go to a nice little hotel, sit around, do whatever, watch TV. I mean, as you can see in these photos, like, look, these women are like cutting down a tree. They're being put to labor in many cases. They might even be put into service as well. They utilize the War Measures Act to do that. Necessarily need to get into that. During World War II, there was a different enemy, although somewhat the same. The Germans, for whatever reason, just like getting involved in conflict. In World War II, in Canada particularly, Italians were interned. Okay, so Benito Mussolini, the leader of the fascist Italian party, who was initially on the enemy side of the war. Because of his actions, because of Italy's actions, all Italians became suspect. Okay, which may or may not make sense. It's really tricky in times of conflict. What do you do if you have a very clear stated enemy? How do you deal with that? It's not obvious. The other thing is, let's say if Canada is at war with a particular group of people, do you think that Canadian citizens are going to be upset at that group of people? Right? So for example, the Ukraine-Russia war. Do you think a lot of Russian people living in North America had a hard time because of what was happening in Russia and Ukraine? Yeah, right? And so there is this idea that maybe to keep these people safe, which doesn't always work out that way, to keep these people safe, sure, take them out of the public atmosphere, particularly, let's say, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, where it might have been easier to get away with crimes, right? It might have been easier to get away with being violent to random strangers, whereas now it's a bit more challenging, right? Like you can't just go beat people up in the street, they'll record you. Okay. Why is my remote not working? Now, with Japanese people, it was particularly rough in North America, so when they were interned, part of the reason may have been, please turn around and not make faces. Part of the reason may have been to protect them. My friend was reading about this. Now, my counter to that was that, well, sure, maybe you're Japanese, you get taken out of your home, all your belongings, to go live in an internment camp to keep you safe, but take a look at take a look at this photo, right? A lot of these Japanese people in North America, their properties were broken into, vandalized, and robbed when they were gone. Many of them lost everything that they had. And so, were they really made to be safe in the long run? I don't know. Right? Maybe they could have lost their life in some of those incidents, but Canada has a history of locking people up when we deem them an enemy. And that's not something that is taught often or looked at. Most Canadians probably aren't aware of that. But that is in our history, and it's not obvious what you're supposed to do in a time of war. There's a really good quote, I forget who it's from. It goes, "There's no good place to stand in a massacre." So there's a world war going on, and Japanese Canadian citizens are being locked up, put into work camps. You know, it's not clear what you're supposed to do. Hopefully you leave Canadian citizens alone, right? If they're third generation, you know, so their grandparents came to Canada, you would hope that by now they have a loyalty to Canada and that they're not going to betray us, but I wasn't alive when this was happening. I don't know how I would have decided or made my decision there. Okay, I think that's where we'll end it today.